Hello and welcome to the Stories of Northern Life from the Sault Ste. Marie Museum. Have you ever wondered who first defined points of the land we call Sault Ste. Marie, and even named a few of our first streets? Well, I'm going to tell you. I would like to begin, though, by acknowledging that we are in Robinson-Huron Treaty territory, and that the land in which we are gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishnaabeg, specifically the Garden River and Batchewana First Nations, as well as Métis People. Throughout this story, I tried my best to find resources to fill in the gaps of the story in regards to the indigenous people who inhabited this land before us. I spoke with the people at Algoma University Library and Collections to see what they had on the matter, and I will share some of that knowledge gained from their resources. Though I still feel unclear on the story from the indigenous point of view, as my resources are all written by settlers' points of view. Nonetheless, I will share what I found, and maybe we can work together to fill in the gaps of this story dating back 177 years ago. I also turned this episode into a blog post as well, so you can follow along with some visuals of the maps. Go to cmuseum.ca under Discover and find our museum musing page, filled with short blog-style postings of influential people, events, and places. So with that all said, let's get into it. Alexander Vidal is the man we are talking about today. As a 26-year-old provincial land surveyor, he arrived by boat in Sault Ste. Marie in the spring of 1846 to survey the town. At that time, most of the settlement was along the waterfront. Vidal and his chain-bearer, a person who measured distance using sections of survey chain, set up camp in the west yard of the Ermitanger House, which in 1846 was a hotel owned by businessman and the first postmaster, David Pym. Vidal started his survey of the town at West Street, which was the city boundary. If you're thinking in today's world, West Street is by Algoma Steel. Then north to below the hill of Bruce Street, then all the way to East Street. This is where the museum is. And then south down to the river. While doing his survey, Chief Shingwak approached Vidal with concerns that the land being surveyed belonged to the Ojibwe people. Vidal promised to bring the matter up to the Commissioner of the Crown Land, P.B. Pabineau. We are unsure if the matter was discussed, and what other proceedings occurred with Shingwak. Vidal hoped that Shingwak would understand that the survey could not be delayed in a country of short summers. The chief understood, so it is said, and the survey continued. Next came the naming and layout for the streets. Vidal wanted the town to reflect the British heritage of the incoming settlers, and as a representative of the British Crown himself. Hence the name Queen, Albert, and Wellington Street. The posts to mark these streets were cut from cedar trees that were found just past the northern boundary of the town. The first post was erected on the south side of Queen Street and East Street, which at the time was Mr. Landfawn's farm. In today's world, you can recognize it by the memorable Muyo's restaurant building, just across the street from us here at the Sault Museum. We have this land post on display in the second floor of the Skylight Gallery, if you're ever interested in checking it out for yourself. Vidal carried on surveying eastward past the town plot. He explained to the settlers that as the Crown representative, he would ensure that the land that they had cleared, worked, and occupied was measured and its ownership transferred to them. A proper title would guarantee this ownership. The land to the north was surveyed into park lots. And after all that, the job was finished. Vidal left Sault Ste. Marie August 22nd and returned to his home and family in Sarnia, Ontario. Just a few years later, the Robinson-Huron Treaty territory came about. The treaty is a legally binding written agreement between two or more sovereign nations. This treaty set aside land for the exclusive use of the Anishnaabeg community, that they would identify as an area suitable for their people and for future generations to live as they always had, unaffected by the settlements of Europeans. Hunting and fishing was guaranteed with unrestricted access to hunt and fish. And lastly, to compensate for the loss of land due to the European settlement, each Anishnaabeg family was guaranteed an annual payment to offset living expenses. As you can gather from Shingwak's first interaction with Fidel, there was a lot of friction and lack of communication between the two communities. The intentions of the British were unknown, and the indigenous people did not like what they were doing. I love this quote from Chief Shingwak, stated in the late 1840s. "You wish to know why we call this our land. We think the answer is very plain. The Great Spirit placed us on this land long before the whites crossed the Great Salt Lake. Our ancestors then lived in happiness. At that time we had everything we could desire. The animals supplied us with food, the skins were taken from their backs and placed on ours for covering." In 1849, Fidel came back to Ontario from September to November. He traveled up to Thunder Bay and down to Toronto, speaking with other representatives of the British Crown and Indigenous groups, gathering documents and important information while discussing the formation of the treaty. When in the Sioux, he met with the local Indigenous groups 2 days in a row, though through the journal of Alexander Fidel, there was definitely lots of tension in these gatherings. The Indigenous were dodging determinations, Fidel wrote. They had to take lots of breaks, and Fidel even left in frustration and let the discussion happen without him, and wrote letters for the rest of the day in solitude. Fidel even spent time across the river on this trip with Mr. Johnston, too. Then went to Garden River with 3 men in a canoe. Shingwakons and the sub-chief were present, and Fidel talked to them about the objects of their mission. It is written that Shingwakons made a favorable reply to Fidel and left. Then Augustine Shingwak's son also came by after dinner that night and asked explanation of some matters. They conversed, and then Augustine left to counsel more with their people. I can only assume that there was a lot of miscommunication with 2 very different languages over such an important subject matter, and that lack of communication and misunderstanding of the treaty made further divide and lack of trust in the treaty in years after this moment. As controversial as it was, Fidel's maps in 1846 laid the groundwork for the future development of Sault Ste. Marie. You can see the names of the first settlers with their blocks of land along the waterfront in his first settler sketches. There were only 43 plots of land, all designated to a last name, who claimed ownership of the land. We even have lists of what was on the land, if there was a home, an enclosure, or a barn, and whom lived there, even if it was not the owner, for example, the sister of a male owner that actually lives on the land. He turned that initial sketch and list of settlers into a well-planned map where streets are formed. In these later maps, you can see the layout that he set out and how that came to life and expanded upon as further development grew. Fidel eventually made more maps growing past West Street to grow the Hudson's Bay Co. in the Canal District we recognize today in 1854. So I hope you learned a little something new about Sault Ste. Marie history today. Maybe it'll make you think a little harder while you're walking down Queen Street or the waterfront, or question who first took ownership of a piece of land here in Sault Ste. Marie. Thank you so much for listening, and come back again next week for another cool episode on Sault Ste. Marie history. Ciao for now!